All right. Well, today we are excited to talk to Winn Collier. Winn, how are you today?
I'm good. Glad to be talking to Kentucky.
Great, great. Winn, you just released just a phenomenal, amazing book, Burning in My Bones, the biography of Eugene Peterson. And just to get started, I would love to hear a little bit of your story and how it intersected with Eugene's.
Well, in 2000, um, actually 99, um, we moved to Colorado where I became a bivocational pastor at a small church that was really struggling. And my wife was going to grad school and they had had two or three splits and um, kind of seemed like a church that was barely hanging on.
Hmm.
And I was fairly fresh out of seminary. I'd been out of seminary a couple of years, and I think I had all these grand ideas about what it meant to be a pastor and how to turn around a church. And all we needed was some new energy and new ideas. And um, one Sunday after church, one of the elders of the church came up to me and said, "Hey, I have a book I think you'll like." And he handed me a copy of Eugene's Working the Angles, The Shape of Pastoral Integrity. And um, told me they thought I'd like it. And I got home. I realized later he meant I think you need it. And I was I was really struggling without exactly knowing it. I was struggling at the time with what does it mean to be a pastor. I had been in a difficult church situation uh, with a pastor who was a bad model to me, and and I just began to think, I don't know what this word means anymore. I don't know what this vocation means anymore. And I was just only a few paragraphs in, and it just smote my heart and
Hmm.
opened something up inside me. And so I began to devour Eugene's writings. And a couple of years later, I was publishing my first book, and one of the editors was a friend of Eugene's, and I got him to give me Eugene's address and started writing him letters. And so over the next 15 uh, years or so, he became a kind of pastor to me over letters that, come to find out later, as I had literally thousands of letters in my basement um, of his, that he was doing this with so many people.
Wow.
We met a few times and just developed a relationship, and ultimately led to writing this biography.
Yeah. And so much of the biography is about Eugene as a pastor. He was a pastor and he just had an intentionally different view of what a pastor was. And that when you look at so much of the way that modern evangelicalism and the church world just thinks about that office of the pastor, can you talk about what was his view of being a pastor? What did that mean to him?
Well, in many respects, it was just the most ordinary thing in the world.
Yeah.
So working the angles was giving the different angles of pastoral integrity. So it was being someone who knew the scriptures and declared the people the good news, the old story of God's action. And I think fundamental to Eugene's entire understanding, not just pastoral but just being a Christian, was that God is the first actor. I mean, God is the one who does everything, and we respond. And we are we are responsible to respond, but ours is response. And I think he felt like, particularly in the American context, we think that we're the main actors. We think that we're the ones who ultimately make things done, get things done. And while hopefully we're a little too Christian to actually say that, it's the way we operate. And um, we feel like we're supposed to really do our part and then ask God to top it off, or ask God to bless what we're up to, or that sort of thing. And so scriptures was the way that we remind ourselves over and over and over again that we're in God's story, not in our story. And so that led to the simplicity of a pastor means you're with people. Um, a pastor's not a pastor if you're not with people. And so, in contrast to a lot of pastoral models where the pastor is a exuberant leader with lots of big ideas and is, oftentimes in some of the paradigms, it's like the pastor is almost removed from the people, but is up doing the strategizing and the leading and, God help us, the visioneering, and then passes it on to, the next level of leaders who then go out and move that into the, and it's very little difference or distinction between what you'd find in a corporate boardroom. And Eugene just said, being a pastor is fundamentally different. And he felt like much of the way we think about pastoring has to do with ambition and has to do with moving along to new opportunities because we're bored or we want to move up the ecclesial ladder. And he just felt like all of that had nothing to do with how the scriptures talk about a pastor being someone who helps people learn how to pray, who helps people hear God, who belong to a place and know that place and know the people and are committed to it and giving them their lives to it.
Yeah. And you use those words ordinary, you use those words simple. And I know in specifically, really what comes to mind is the introduction to Working the Angles. He really fleshes this out. But what were some of his concerns with the way that we talk about, we use those words visionary, we use those words leader, we toss those words around just really flippantly in the church when it comes to pastor? What were his concerns with, I guess you could say, what we were doing to the office of pastor and the way we were thinking about it?
Well, we were Americanizing it.
Yeah.
We were not taking our cues from the true shepherd, but we were taking our cues from um, Wall Street and corporate America and the entrepreneurial spirit, which is embedded into the American psyche. Um, he talked a lot about wanting to regain the dignity and the nobility of being a pastor.
Hmm.
And I think he felt like, I have to be careful a little bit when we talk about this, because it wasn't like he felt like there was only one way to be a pastor and you had to sort of have his personality and look like him. And that wasn't it at all. In fact, he was really opposed to that. And he thought it was because pastoring is so particular. It's each person's gift. It's each person's congregation, each person's village or town or city that is going to shape how these deep biblical truths get worked out in a particular context. But he saw what was happening sort of writ large in our context, in pastoral leadership, et cetera, was was a cookie cutter approach. It was this constant, like, if you do these 7 things, if you follow these images, if you replicate yourself in this way, then you're going to have a growing church. And he would say, sort of tongue in cheek, I think, that church growth was 20% Holy Spirit and 80% being in the right place at the right time. And he felt like we thought way too much of ourselves for what we can accomplish. And I think he also was concerned about ways and means. So um, to a certain extent, sometimes it feels like within a lot of the sort of growing church world that the end result is more people in the room. And hopefully it's grown enough to say more people being discipled and more people becoming like Jesus. But he kept wanting to insist the way you do that has as much to do about the outcomes as it does as the end result. So in other words, the way we help people know Jesus is essential to people knowing Jesus.
Mm.
And so you can't do a mass-produced, uh, um, devoid of relationship, devoid of Trinitarian reality, process or way of bringing people to Jesus, and then expect somehow discipleship to magically happen. So in his spiritual theology, last 5 books, one of them was called The Jesus Way, and the whole point was there are many counterfeit ways to use power and influence, and the church is riddled by them. Jesus offers a counter way. And so I think in the bottom line, answer your question is, I think his biggest concern was that we were grabbing all kinds of idolatrous ways of leading God's people and pastoring God's people that was not following the one who to whom we say we are bending our knee and declaring as Lord.
Yeah, and you've got so many great stories in the book, but is there a particular moment when Eugene kind of came to that realization that, the Americanization of ministry and just the dangers in it? In the book, you call it that he found himself at the center of the Great War. Was there a moment when he came to this kind of realization, or just over time through a series of experiences?
Yeah, I don't think there was any one moment, but there were, he was early into helping to form the new church that he pastored for 29 years, Christ Our King in Baltimore, outside of Baltimore, Bel Air, Maryland. And, so this was when the sort of church growth movement was really just starting to get moving. And, so he would go to this big conference where they were meeting with this expert who was supposed to be telling them how you grow a church. And he had this huge manual that the guy handed out, and it was kind of like, you know, whatever the question was, you thumb through the index and you get to the answer, and there it is. And and there was a moment where the fellow made some comment to the effect of, um, the size of your parking lot will have a whole lot more to do with the growth of your church than the sermons you're preaching on a Sunday morning. And I think when he heard that, he's like, that's ridiculous. And if that's true, and perhaps it is true. I mean, perhaps it is, it's true in the way things work. But his thought was, if that's true, then that isn't the kind of growth I'm looking for. That isn't the kind of growth that has anything at all to do with what the scriptures are describing the church to be and do. So I think it was kind of that ways and means again. He would say, look, if that's where we're aiming for, then I'm aiming for something radically different, and I'm going to have to do a different to get a different result.
Yeah. And I love how in the book, I mean, you show Eugene, I mean, he struggled with this. He struggled with, success. He struggled with comparison and ambition. Was there a way that he would know if he was, I guess you could say, getting too far over the line, or maybe getting too close to the line, rather, from holy ambition to personal ambition?
Yeah. Um, like for Eugene, and this could be wrong. I'm trying to kind of go through the texts right now in my mind, but I actually don't think I ever heard him use the word ambition in a positive sense.
Wow.
Um, Now, I don't. Again, he was a writer and into metaphor and the elastic use of language. I don't think he would argue with somebody who wanted to use that word but I just think there was something about that word that just connoted to him um, a kind of self-centered um, effort that he just made a choice that he was going to absolutely distance himself from. And
Mm.
some of it was because he felt the poison in his own blood, right? I mean, he was a competitive person.
Mhm.
Um, I don't think there was ways of knowing like how he went over the line. I think it was just much more about energy. Like, like there wasn't a line to cross. It was, am I operating in the curious, hopeful, restful, trustful presence that God is up to something? Um, or am I trusting and relying on human ingenuity, power? Um, I think that's one of the reasons why he was so adamantly committed to Sabbath.
Mm.
Um, and then it wasn't just a discipline in his life; it was a posture of his interior being before God. And honestly, I don't know much more how to say it other than to say I do think if you are a person of Sabbath, I think ambition is something that is constantly being chastened in your life because those two things just don't reside very well together.
Yeah. Yeah. I would love to hear how your relationship with Eugene impacted you as a pastor, impacted your ministry and just the way that you thought about these kind of things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he became my pastor, and there was no other voice that more influenced how I understood being a pastor than him. So there's probably a sense in which I could say I don't. It might be easier to answer the question, how did he? What are the areas where he didn't influence? Um, but I think one of the things is he just his his presence in the world, his he was just really comfortable with himself. Um,
Hmm.
Something that really was different for me. I second guessed myself a lot more than I ever encountered him doing. Um, I I think I want I mean, he always felt like an outsider, which I kind of resonate with, but he seemed he seemed less like he didn't care as much about being understood as I do. I think I would like to be more understood. Um, but knowing that Eugene existed in the world and that he just for most days felt really comfortable being his own person, being misunderstood oftentimes, that he had this such a deep, intimate, rich life with God that exuded a stability in him that I longed for.
Hmm.
I think it did give me courage to follow my pastoral instincts, so that when I was in environments, which I often was, that just felt like we were talking a different language, or um, the things I was aiming for seemed silly in
Hmm.
certain ways, or the things I wasn't aimed for, maybe is a better way to put it, seemed ridiculous. That I just like I remembered Eugene was out there in the world, and that I wasn't crazy. Um, Eugene used to say one of the most important jobs of a pastor is to help someone learn how to pray, and particularly coupled with his really wide and expansive understanding of what prayer is, that's a pretty deeply beautiful and profound way to live in the world. So that when I'm standing up to preach, for instance, on a Sunday, just to recognize this isn't my moment to impress these people. I'm not an oracle. Um, I'm here because God has already spoken, and I'm here to help these people listen to what God has already said. That's a freeing posture.
Yeah.
Um, I think I think following Eugene's example freed me up from feeling like I needed to um, count numbers and feel the pressure. Particularly as I was the last 12 years, I was a pastor of a new church, and those first few years, I mean, you're in a pressure box. You got limited time, and if it doesn't make it, you're in trouble. But I think there was something that I had followed Eugene enough as he was following Jesus to be mostly free from those kinds of anxieties. Um, and I honestly am not sure that I would have done that in a healthy way like that if I hadn't known and um, learned the Jesus way from Eugene.
Yeah. Where did that flow out of? Just that confidence, I guess, or just the comfort in being who he was? Obviously, it flowed out of his life with God, but is that something that he intentionally devoted work to? Where did that come from?
I mean, there is part of it which just seems to me like it was a grace, you
Okay.
know. I mean, there and the thing about Eugene for me was you just it was rarely like any one thing he said. It wasn't a single sermon. It wasn't even a single book. There was just something about Eugene that you'd I'd go to his house and I would come in with my questions or anxieties or whatever, and you're there an hour, and all of a sudden you realize you're different. Like your questions have changed, your anxieties have mostly ebbed away. It was pretty hard to be anxious in Eugene's presence.
Wow.
Um, and there was just something that he knew about God. Um, and when you were around him, and if you were open to it, um, I think you found yourself coming into his world,
Hmm.
and his world was filled with God. And um, so you'd have this really intense theological dilemma you wanted him to help you unwrap, and maybe he would a little bit, but usually somehow you just found the theological dilemma didn't matter to you the way you thought it did,
Hmm.
um, because he was asking different kinds of questions, and um, and Jan was part of that too. I mean, their home was a sacred space. It was a place of joy and hospitality and prayer and love and laughter, and you just kind of got caught up into their world when you were there. And so I do think that in it, it's reflected a little bit in that the opening story in the biography of when Eric is tiptoeing down and sees his dad. There certainly was an interior life with God that um, it's a little interesting to talk about. He wouldn't like the word discipline.
Hmm.
Um, he felt like even that word discipline in our American vocabulary usually evoked kinds of self effort that were the opposite of the gospel. Um, but there was intentionality, but it didn't feel like work. It
Hmm.
was it was pretty natural for him, which I think frees us up to find our own natural way.
Yeah.
So for instance, oftentimes when people would ask him, how do I learn how to pray? One of his first questions would often be, well, what do you love? He didn't jump to like, oh, well, here's the disciplines. He went more deeply first into, well, how has God made you? Where does your heart come alive? And then how do we help that become prayer? So all that to say, I, I think there was just something that Eugene surrendered to early on in God and encountered in God, and then just kept going in a way that um, freed him up from uh, at least some of the ways my anxieties work out. He had his own ways, and he was far from perfect,
Oh yeah.
and, and he struggled. But it does feel like his anxieties played out in different ways than mine do.
Yeah. You said several times there in that answer that he saw one of the main works of being a pastor is to help people to pray.
Hmm.
Can you flesh that out a little bit more?
Yeah. Um, an interesting exercise would be going through all of Eugene's writings, and then if you could expand it to his letters and his journals, you'd have a whole other sphere. But to just write down all the things he said, he would say, prayer is, and he would say something, prayer is answering speech, prayer is awareness of God, prayer is our heart being awakened by God, et cetera, et cetera. So for Eugene, prayer wasn't, so what we think of as prayer is I'm going to stop, take 5 minutes and pray to God. That was a way of prayer. That wasn't the definer of prayer. Um, I even wonder, I'm not sure I ever heard him say this, but I wonder if he would almost say that's the beginning point of prayer.
Hmm.
Um, for Eugene, prayer is a life lived attentive to God.
Hmm.
As I told his story, I realized that at some point, I'm not being super literal here, but prayer became less something Eugene did and more something Eugene was. He was a prayer. Um, so I think he would say, um, what is more fundamental for a pastor than to help people become aware of God? Um, is there anything that we do that at its end doesn't have that as its aim? Um, so, for instance, as in practical terms, um, when we're preaching, we're not really trying to give people little life lessons to help them um, navigate um, a difficult relationship. As we encounter God and we become our truest self alive in God, does that transform us in ways that our relationships are transformed? Absolutely. But the difference is that God is the aim, God is the energy, God is the purpose, God is the hope. Um, I do think he felt like many times we were using God to our own ends as opposed to having our life um, reshaped by the one who is our life, by God. And that required prayer. That required a life that was attentive to God, that was hearing God speak and then responding, that was recognizing that in every um, the dew of every morning that we see in our morning walks, in the laughter of one we love, in a scripture that awakens something in our heart, in um, a moment of grief, that in all of those places, it is God who is present. It is God who is speaking. And the moment we forget that God is there, um, that's the moment where fear and disillusionment and um, our anxieties take over. But the Christian way is to recognize and hear and see God and then respond. And that's prayer.
Yeah. Wow. You know, a big part of the book, you talk about Eugene and his relationship with his family, Jan and their kids. Um, I love how you say in the book that he talk about there were times when he didn't draw maybe the boundaries that he needed to between, say, his church ministry and his family. And then you realize that in later years. What were some of those boundaries that he missed, you think?
Mainly it was just time. He really tended to being a workaholic. Um, he he gave himself to his church, and some of his family members would say he didn't give himself enough to them.
Mm.
So his oldest son Eric, the way he would describe it is, whenever Dad was around, he was Like we had all of him. He was there. It was beautiful. The problem is we didn't have him there enough.
Hmm.
And I think there was a real ache in Eric's heart that he didn't have as much of his dad as he wanted. Now, interestingly, the other kids, Karen and Leaf, they would describe it differently. They didn't quite carry that same wound, even though Karen is the one who, when she was little, one evening asked her dad to read her a bedtime story, and he said, "I'm sorry, I can't have to go to a meeting at church." And she said, "Dad, you've been gone 27 nights in a row." And that was the evening when she said that, he walked to the church for the evening meeting and he turned in his resignation.
Yeah.
And that's when he said, I'm done running this damn church.
Hmm.
And so that was a real changing point, shifting point when he says he's actually started becoming a pastor.
Wow.
He stopped running the church and started pastoring the people.
Yeah, that's powerful. Wow. You know, one of the things that you hear from time to time, and you hear this from people in the church, pastors, leaders in the church, is we're just constantly on this quest for the perfect church. We're looking for the perfect church that can provide this for my family. We're looking for the perfect church that can give us this ministry opportunity, climb the ecclesial ladder. What would Eugene say to that? What was his idea of just this constant quest, it seems, for the perfect church?
Well, he would just say it's a lie. It doesn't exist. He would say that the real danger is that you're always looking for something you don't have, and you're not present to what God has actually given to you.
Hmm.
And again, I would think he would say this is for all of our modern advancements and the good things that have come. This is another casualty of the modern world, is that we believe we can always improve, and we're
Hmm.
on this constant quest. And the problem is we don't belong anywhere.
Wow.
So long as we um, are looking for the next good thing, we don't belong. And true love requires responsibility. True love is to give yourself and lay down your life. There's not very much that Jesus said about how we're to live in friendship and relationship with one another that fits with what you just described. Um, you can't lay your life down for someone if you're not even willing to commit to being present with them.
Hmm.
Um, if you're always looking for what's the next thing, um, then um, that's just a dehumanizing way to live. And he would just say, it's not in the Bible. Like,
Hmm.
particularly he would hear people talking about, let's just get back to this first century church, let's, and he would just say, where is this church you're describing? Like, please, I mean, take me to the scriptures and show me where there is this church that we're trying to get back to.
Hmm.
Um, um, says more about our idolatries and addictions than it does about the actual story of the church that we're given. There is no perfect congregation, he would say. There is a messy group of sinners trying to hear and respond to Jesus. Whenever someone would ask him advice on how to find a church, he would say, well, find the closest church to you and go to it. And if they would say, well, I can't do that, I can't survive in that church, he would say, well, go for 6 months. And if you can't make it after 6 months, then you find the next closest church and you go to it. Um, Now, in all fairness, when they lived in Flathead, uh, at the Flathead Lake, they went to a Lutheran church, which was maybe the second or third closest church to them.
Yeah.
So even there, it wasn't, he wasn't being necessarily dogmatic or literal, but he was punching against this idea of This vast world is mine, unlimited options.
Hmm.
And everything that was driving the question was, what do I want? And he thought there was another far more fundamental question, which is, what is God doing and who am I responsible to?
That's good. Yeah. You know, when at the time of this recording, here we are, we're still in the middle of the pandemic, and a lot of pastors, church leaders, they just find themselves discouraged. They feel like their work is not as significant as maybe it once was, or doesn't matter. They're, and so many things. What do you think Eugene would say into this moment to church leaders who just find themselves discouraged right now?
Hmm. Yeah, I'm always super hesitant to like say what Eugene would say, because most of the time when I thought he would say something, he would say something different.
Yeah.
Um, I don't really know exactly what Eugene would say, but I do think that there is a gift in this time, I think, um, because it is taking away a lot of the illusions,
Hmm.
particularly when you frame it as, people, some of us as pastors feeling like our work isn't as significant as it once was and all. I think if we're feeling that way, it actually would be a really tender gift to pause and maybe with someone that we really trust, a spiritual director or another pastoral friend, or and think about like why why that is that we feel that way.
It's good.
Um, on one hand, yes, it's just exhausting. I mean, it is exhausting to have our entire infrastructure, you know, turned upside down, to not be able to be physically present with people as we're used to. Um, um, and those things, we just need time and grace. I mean, we just need to receive the love of Christ and know that God will carry us through this moment. But there's another side of it, which is um, I don't know that there's been a time in my pastoral life when there was more obvious pain.
Hmm.
I don't know a time in my pastoral ministry where there was more uncertainty about our future, where our nerves were more on edge, where our families felt more tenuous. Um, so there's never been a moment that I know of where pastoral voice was more needed. Um, so it kind of makes me question what it is that we're thinking gives us significance as a pastor.
It's good.
What is it that makes our work? Is it having a full room? Um, is it knowing what to do and feeling like we're the expert? I do think um, a lot of pastors are going to need a break after this.
Hmm.
I need a sabbatical. I mean, and all that is absolutely true. But I also think um, we're going to need to allow ourselves to be released from the ways that we have learned over decades to find meaning in our work and to be abandoned to the absolute mercy of Christ, that I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to pastor in a pandemic. I don't know what our church will look like on the other side. I'm not going to fall prey to the siren calls that are already beginning to tell me how this is a new day and we're going to build a new church. And like, to me, that is mostly noise.
Hmm.
Um, what I would want to think about is um, particular names of particular families that I know and where they are hurting, and how do I continue to be present to them and to remind them that God is with us, and how do I announce the good news to our church over and over again, even when they don't want to hear it, that no, we don't know what the future holds, but we are following the one who raises dead things to life, who sees a future we don't see, whose love is never ending, and um, that God is no less powerful because of COVID. Um, and our future is wrapped up in the one who loves us.
Hmm. That's a strong word, and even wrapped up in what you said there. I think that's honestly one of the reasons I think your book is such a gift, because this is a moment where, like you said, so many pastors, churches, they're just tired. They're wondering what's next. And in this book, you're given this vision. And again, like you said, Eugene's not perfect, but it's a vision of a different way. It's a vision of another way to live and to walk in this calling. And so Winn, I know you've heard it a lot of times, but man, thank you so much for this book. It's a gift to the church. It's a true gift.
Well, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
And there might be some people who are watching, and maybe they're new to Eugene Peterson and his work. Is there a good place for the person, and maybe they're not a pastor, they're just somebody that's watching or listening to this, a good place to start in Eugene's work? Maybe so here, if you were to recommend to somebody, hey, if Eugene Peterson is a new name to you, you're not familiar with him very much, here's a good place to go.
If you're a pastor, I would start with Working the Angles. It's just the book that was my entry, and I I still find it to be so beautifully helpful.
Hmm.
Um, if you're not a pastor, I don't know. I might start with one of his most classic works, which is Along Obedience in the Same Direction, or perhaps Leap Over a Wall, which is his engagement with the Psalms,
Hmm.
which is a really beautiful book too. And I think that would definitely give you a taste for this slow, God saturated, um, uh, reverent, reverential, and yet curious and generous um, engagement with God and the scriptures that uh, this really gives me a lot of hope.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, Winn, this has been great. Anybody that is watching or listening, and they would love to hear more from you, connect with you, what are some ways they can do that online?
Yeah. So I'm the director at the Eugene Peterson Center for Christian Imagination at Western Seminary, and they can find us there at thepetersoncenter.org, or my personal writing site is Winn, Winn Collier, COLLIER.com.
Okay. Awesome. We'll have links to all of that, the book, everything in the show notes. Winn, this has been great. Thanks so much for talking to us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.